Some really interesting work here. A big survey. Real quick, what did that survey find? Tell us.
Yeah, sure. So we did 3 pieces of really proprietary evidence with our UBS Evidence Lab. One, we surveyed consumers in multiple countries, including China, Japan, the UK, and the US, to understand around consumer intent. We also surveyed all of the consumer reviews online with respect to the devices that have already launched. And we also looked at Google search data to understand how, again, intent versus desire around these launched devices was trending through the holiday period. And we think, as you let in, Corey, that we think we're at a tipping point where the devices are at a certain price point. The consumer interest is now starting to build, especially in markets like China and Japan. And with that tipping point around price plus intent could mean going forward that we see broader adoption by the consumer marketplace.
So one additional question I have for you is, how do you see the play of content into that ecosystem? Because, of course, price is one key factor here, but the other is the availability of great content to make the purchase of those devices really useful. So curious how you see content developing in the market.
It's a great question, and it really is at the heart of the matter, right? I mean, ecosystems, when they get built up, are really chicken and egg issues, right? You have to have the hardware, then you have to have the content. Go back to the original launch of the iPhone over 10 years ago. It took about a year or two for the application ecosystem to really catch up to the iPhone. We see no different here. When you listen now to Google, when you listen to Facebook, even Sony as well, they're talking about seeding that content themselves to try to stimulate a content ecosystem that you can consume on these devices. It was a key talking point for Mark Zuckerberg on the Facebook call the other night, and Google also talking about YouTube content, talking about their Daydream VR platform and getting sports leagues and sports teams to put more and more content on their ecosystem. That is what feeds that sort of chicken and egg into an actual consumption cycle on both sides, the hardware and the software.
So one of the interesting things I thought you did was sort of look at unit economics as what it costs for each device, which is really tricky because the back end is very different. Sometimes, you know, in the PlayStation example, you've already got the back end of a PlayStation machine. Oculus demands that you have a very expensive computer. But the component costs, I want to stick with this for just a second. We put together a slide, if you will, that shows us this. And so what struck me was that a lot of the, first of all, there's not a lot of components, but the componentry was just a couple things. The display, I use the Sony one as an example from your report, 19% of the cost at $35. The application processor, another big chunk of cost, 5%. The accelerometer, just $1, or 1%, I said it's $3. But 47% alone was the case cost. And what's interesting to me about that is, in your argument, that's the piece that could come down in cost. So the economies of scale already exist for accelerometers and application processors and the chips that other people make. But the component of like plastics and headbands and stuff, you think that's where the cost could really come down?
Well, look at some of what we've seen in the marketplace already. The Samsung Gear VR, which has sold quite well during the holiday period, is a higher price point. That's closer to $300. But look at the Google Daydream VR device. You know, that is actually closer to $79 and is now being sold for closer to $50 on the online Google store right now. We think there are going to be different ways to approach this market, from form factor, right, and to your point, what's the band going to cost? How expensive is it going to be on your head going forward? And then you're right, away from the device itself is what is it tethered to. If it tethers to your mobile device, you're going to keep costs overall down. If it tethers to a $1,500 gaming PC, now you're talking about a much higher end experience, but also a much higher end cost.
Eric, just about 20 seconds left. Who's the first big winner here among all the companies, Oculus, Sony, HTC, beyond?
Early days, Sony, because it's tied to the game experience of the VR. I think Google and Samsung are going to be the next to watch, tied to the mobile device. Longer tailed, it's Oculus. It's the best experience. It's the most expensive. They have to get the cost curve down to make it a better consumer product, but that's why Facebook's made that long-term bet.